Welcome to Fantasy Focus Football presented by Wingstop. My name is Daniel Dopp alongside Stephania Bell, Field Yates, and Liz Loza. A little red versus blue team going on here as Liz and Field and Stephania, you guys are all dressed up in some shade of red, and I am wearing a blue sweater because it is sweater weather for what it's worth. I just didn't get the memo. Did you guys, were you on a separate group text that you just didn't want to include me on this morning?
So do we tell them now or not?
I know. We just decided to be festive.
Oh, you guys are Bills fans. You wanted to wear the red for the Buffalo Bills in order to like rub it in even more for me. Got it.
Well, I don't want to speak for Field, though I think I can in this instance. Stephania wore a gorgeous red jumpsuit and inspired me to become more festive. I'm sure that's what happened, given Stephania's great influence to you as well.
Correct. Yes, no, I would say that there are many ways in which Stephania has separated herself from the pack of the people that are normally here, because Liz and Stephania playing a different ballgame than Daniel, Mike, and myself.
That's
but
true.
Fashion, certainly one of the areas where Stephania is just like, you little minions play in an entirely different pool than me.
I'm really pumped to be able to see you guys. I obviously was not on Fantasy Football Now on Sunday. I did the Army-Navy game this weekend, which was
awesome,
very fun to do my very first
cool.
college football game and have it be a rivalry game between Army and Navy, so that was very fun. But Liz, I'm so pumped to be able to see you. Love it when Liz Loza gets to be on the show here on Fantasy Focus.
You got a lot of me this week, so.
I know. I'm ready for it.
Can you handle it?
I'm ready. I don't know.
The audience loves it too.
We're about to find out. Well, we've got a huge show set up for today. Obviously, very first week of the playoffs. And everybody, it feels like, crushed. If there was anybody that you needed to count on, I mean, there were a handful of duds, and we'll get into it. Okay. But
Highs and lows is how I would describe. Highs and lowes is how I would describe yesterday.
Look at that.
Nailed it.
But there was, like, the highs were, like, super high for a lot of players here. A lot of positive vibes. We obviously are going to do our takeaways here in Week 15, as well as diving into our studs and duds and a couple of quick shout-outs. But Liz, why don't we start this off on a positive vibe, uplift all the spirits here. What is your big Week 15 takeaway?
That Brian Thomas Jr. is that dude. I mean, there were a lot of red flags about his potential production heading into this game. And he, no offense, Daniel, you did have a clip out about that.
I know, not great, not
but
great.
he put all of those to rest. Most of them had to do with this matchup against the Jets, and yet the rookie laid 32 fantasy points on the Jets. Not only is that the highest total that any player has managed, forget wide receiver, any player has managed, it's the highest total that any player has managed against the Jets over the last 3 seasons.
Wow.
Double-digit targets again for Brian Thomas Jr. Obviously, the injuries to the offense have helped boost his volume, but the Mac Jones of it all has not stopped him from producing. This is an interesting tidbit. He entered Week 15 as Fantasy's wide receiver 9 overall, tied with the exact same number of fantasy points overall as Malik Neighbors.
Wow.
And yet, Brian Thomas Jr. was drafted 113th overall. Malik Neighbors drafted 41st overall, and Marvin Harrison Jr., the other rookie, 20th overall. So what an incredible value Brian Thomas Jr. has been this season.
He was awesome. Maybe a good reminder for future years that absent of being a situation, maybe like a Roma Dunze, where he's getting drafted somewhere where he's probably going to have to wait his turn. Brian Thomas Jr. going to Jacksonville, where yes, there was Christian Kirk, and yes, they did sign Gabe Davis, but we all have seen Gabe before. Not an alpha type wide receiver. Draft players that get drafted highly in decent situations. My big takeaway is, you guys actually may not remember this, but Devontae Smith did complain last week. The thing about Devontae Smith is that when he talks,
it's quiet.
Yeah, it's like a church mouse, right? So he was like,
I couldn't hear him over the A.J. Brown complaining.
So you guys didn't realize this, but yeah, he did say something last week. Now, A.J. Brown obviously said what he needed to say after the game last week when he was asked, what does the Eagles offense need to work on? Passing. Turns out squeaky wheels don't just get the grease. They get enough grease for themselves and somebody else, as the entire Eagles passing game was incredible yesterday. No Dallas Goedert, but the two players that you care about the most went off. How about this? A.J. Brown, 25.0 fantasy points yesterday. 11 targets, 8 catches, 110 yards, and a touchdown. That's a season high in terms of targets, receptions, and fantasy points. Devontae Smith was even better. 12 catches, 12 targets, 11 receptions, 109 yards, and a touchdown. That's good for 28.0 fantasy points. A season high in targets, receptions, and fantasy points. Jalen Hurts, once again, awesome, but he's been, despite the passing game issues, he's been just typical Jalen Hurts dominant.
Yeah.
28.1 fantasy points yesterday for Jalen Hurts. Of course, he had a tush-push touchdown that did not go to Saquon Barkley. I'm sure there are a lot of people that were watching that thinking to themselves, can I just get one for Saquon? Just one, like just one play for Saquon Barkley. But the Eagles' passing offense thrived yesterday. I think there is a reasonable conversation to be had, as we talked about last week. Do they need to totally change their offense? They'd won 9 straight games. They don't need to do it, but I believe strongly that if Philadelphia is going to be able to play with the biggest of dogs in the playoffs, whether it's Detroit or maybe the LA Rams or maybe the Chiefs or the Bills in the Super Bowl, they're going to have to play better offense. They did yesterday, and it worked out great for all of us in fantasy football. It was fantastic, Stephania, and they are now 12-2. The Jets aren't, but they also showed it's never too late for fantasy points.
Listen to me. If I had told you that at the end of week 15, you'd have 2 Jets players in the top 10 of all fantasy points scored.
Yeah.
Would you believe me?
No.
I mean, Lazard's been good this year, but top 10 for a
make
full
a good
week.
point.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't believe I wanted him
I think
to
he
score.
might have had a catch.
Yeah, he might have had a catch. I really wanted him to score just to burn Mike Clay. But, oh, my gosh, it was the coming out party for the Davante Adams, Aaron Rodgers chemistry. And, by the way, where was this before this week? But if you were brave enough to start them both, you got to double dip into fantasy goodness. Davante Adams right now is the #1 fantasy point scorer for the week with 42.8 fantasy points. He joined the Jets in week 7, and it's been sort of slow going, but gradually working his way up. But yesterday, 9 catches on 12 targets, 198 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He was actually pretty silent in the first half.
Quite literally
so
silent.
That there was 0 fantasy points, and there was one target, didn't have a catch, but then in the second half, it was the big plays, and that's where Davante Adams can hurt you. The first touchdown that he scored, by the way, in the third quarter was his 100th of his career, so kind of a milestone for him. And then the second was a career-long 71-yard touchdown catch. So Davante Adams pays off in terms of the volume of targets where Aaron Rodgers is looking for him, and he also pays off in the explosive play, so you get a lot of points at once. But Aaron Rodgers might have been the most surprising because Aaron Rodgers had the 7th most rushing yards of his career. Now, it was only 45 yards, but it's still fantasy points nonetheless. 6 carries for 45 yards, 16 of 30 through the air, 3 touchdowns, 30.06 fantasy points as of right now. He's the 4th quarterback on the week behind Josh Allen, Jared Goff, and Lamar Jackson. Nobody had this on their bingo card.
Nope.
I guarantee you. And
Nope.
here's the thing. As much as we want to celebrate the, hey, fantasy goodness for week 1, I'm pissed.
Yeah.
I'm pissed because I didn't see this sooner. So maybe if you had them, they didn't help you get to the playoffs. And I'm wondering how many people actually started Aaron Rodgers. Davante Adams, sure.
I can
Aaron
tell you
Rodgers,
that Dan Graziano started Davante Adams against me in our FF Now League. He left Brian Thomas Jr. on his bench.
Wow.
And the first half, I was sailing. I was like, oh, I'm going to
Yeah,
win.
let's go.
16, here I come, baby.
It was Zay Flowers versus Brian Thomas Jr. in his
Yep.
flex for him.
And he chose Zay Flowers over Brian Thomas Jr. And then he obviously started Davante Adams. And it looks like, I do still have, no, I'm done. I'm done in that league. That's right. I'm done. He destroyed me. Thank you to Davante Adams.
It hurts more when it's the Jets that beat you.
Yeah.
for
I
the
feel like
season they've had.
the people that would have started Aaron Rodgers are people that play in 2 quarterback or super flex leagues, right? So if you have Field, are you one of those guys?
Yeah, in our dynasty league.
Humble
Yeah.
brag there.
Okay.
No, I just like it. I didn't. The funny part is I in that league with some injuries, my quarterback options for my second QB are Aaron Rodgers and Mac Jones. And in the first half, Mac Jones was playing pretty well. And I was like, am I going to potentially lose a fantasy playoff matchup because I chose Aaron Jones, Aaron Rodgers over Mac Jones? Like, what is happening to me right now? But that is fantasy football. I just want to convey to these people, what a weird week it was. Again, the highs and the lows. But Davante Adams, thank you for being such a ridiculous stalwart yesterday. But I'll say this. The best fantasy game of the year, and I've said this a couple of times throughout the season, so those that I previously categorized as the best fantasy game of the year, too bad. You're no longer the best fantasy game of the year because the best fantasy game of the year was yesterday, Daniel Dopp.
Detroit Lions and the Buffalo Bills. I got to be honest, before I say anything, this hurts my heart on so many levels because not only did the Detroit Lions not win, but I got bounced in 2 playoff leagues where I was the #1 seed with the most points scored because I played against people starting Detroit Lions.
Oh my God, no.
And so, unfortunately,
Wow.
I didn't
That's
get
like
anything good
insult
from
on
this.
top
Yeah, it
of
was really
everything.
terrible.
Was that
However,
like a league and eight teams make the playoffs, or 4 teams make the playoffs?
it was a 6-team. There was an 8-team playoff league in which I lost to a 13-year-old that is my niece's
Nice.
friend from school. I've never hated a 13-year-old more in my life than I do right now.
You probably never hated a 13-year-old in general.
No, exactly. And then our buddy Kurt Vandermoss in a different league that I have, he had Lamar Jackson and Amon-Ra St. Brown and Sam Laporta. And when you look at this game,
wow.
listen, first off, this game had 1,092 total yards.
That's it?
There were 12 touchdowns that were scored, including an offensive lineman. Shout out to Dan Skipper.
Yeah.
Most importantly, quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, and kickers in this game alone combined for 314.4 fantasy points. Josh Allen had over 41 points himself, 363 passing yards and 2 touchdowns, plus 68 yards on the ground and 2 rushing touchdowns. Jared Goff had 494 passing yards and 5 touchdowns and added, I could not believe it, 13 yards on the ground.
baby.
Shout out to Jared Goff.
Moving the chains.
13 yards on the ground.
13, not a lucky number for you, buddy.
No, it is not, unfortunately. It's been tough. Both of these quarterbacks, though, getting over 41 fantasy points, and it wasn't just the quarterback position. James Cook, the first running back to top 100 rushing yards on the Detroit Lions this season, 105 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, and a reception for 28 yards, good enough for 26.3 fantasy points. Him and Ty Johnson had the most yards from scrimmage of any 2 running backs all season long against the Detroit Lions, and it happened here in Week 15. Jahmyr Gibbs also crushed it from that running back spot. It is now his 8th game over 100 yards from scrimmage, 8 carries for 31 yards and a touchdown, plus 5 receptions for 83 yards and a touchdown. Like that hook and ladder at the end of the game, I needed that on a ESPN bet, prop that I had, so I was very glad to be able to get that. That was good for 28.4 fantasy points, but I'm not done. Wide receivers, Amon-Ra St. Brown had 18 targets. Field, we've been talking about this. Just throw the ball to Amon-Ra St. Brown. 14 catches,
die on that hill.
193 yards and a touchdown. Good for 37.3 fantasy points, season high in targets, season high in receptions, and receiving yards, his 2nd most fantasy points of the season. But even if you start a Khalil Shakir on the other side, he got you 15.9 fantasy points. Sam Laporta got you over 18 fantasy points. This was just, if you needed big performances, you were like, this was the game you hoped you had somebody from, because it just delivered so many gifts to fantasy managers.
We thought it might deliver. I mean, we were talking about it ahead of time. I just don't think we thought it would deliver that much. But I'll tell you one thing. I bet you Josh Allen is in the finals of his fantasy football league. Because you remember, after last week, he said he started himself, and he saw how that worked out. So I'm sure he started himself again yesterday.
He is the first quarterback. I saw Tristan H. Cockcroft put this out. First quarterback in NFL history for fantasy football to score 40 points in back-to-back games. And it was the last game of the regular season and the first game of the fantasy playoffs.
So all those other players are definitely notable. Like if you have Amon-Ra, you're starting him obviously, and Jahmyr Gibbs, you're starting him obviously. James Cook, maybe it was a little bit of a different conversation this week, but he was like, you're starting him with less confidence than normal. The story to me is Josh Allen. I mean, what you just mentioned, the history that he made, over 90 fantasy points over the past 2 weeks. So the most fantasy points in a 2-game stretch by a quarterback ever. And, we can talk about great performances throughout the season. They matter every single week, but they matter most late in the season. Right? Because if you're a team that maybe needed to win and get in the playoffs last week and you had Josh Allen, you're in. And if that's what you needed to get into the playoffs, you are probably a low seed, probably facing a good team this week. You might well have won your matchup this week because of the brilliance of Josh Allen. And as we think for the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks if you play into week 18, is there any player right now going into week 16, if you're like, I'm in the playoffs in whatever number of leagues, that's the one guy I don't want to face. I felt like for a lot of this season, deservedly, it was Ja'Marr Chase. And maybe you would still say it is Ja'Marr Chase, but because we are so, I think we have this recency bias. Chase had 9 catches for 94 yards. A pedestrian, 18.4 points for Ja'Marr Chase yesterday. Is there anything scarier than facing Josh Allen right now?
Nope.
No.
He's
Because of the fact that he can do everything through the air and with his legs.
Yeah.
And I think I saw over 850 yards of offense by him alone in the last 2 weeks.
Stop it.
It's insane.
Are you kidding me?
I mean,
insane.
he's just put so much out there in terms of being able to run the ball, throw the ball, and he's willing to take the chances with his body that somehow his body seems to be able to endure. He got x-rays after the game yesterday. checked out fine, but he like took himself in, just wanted to make sure shoulder was fine. All good.
I'll tell you what happened actually yesterday. He's walking out of the tunnel, and one of the NFL consultants who's handling the medical stuff in Detroit was like, dude, I need to take the x-rays because I got to see the dog inside.
Yeah,
because
the
that's what
puppies
it is.
in the
No, that's not a
lungs.
puppy. That's a friggin' German Shepherd inside of Josh Allen. That guy's got so much dog inside of him. Holy crap. I mean, just an absurd performance. Certainly, amongst the best we have ever seen in the 2-week period for any player ever. And if you care about the real NFL MVP, Josh Allen has certainly made a very compelling case for him with 3 games left to go.
I'm going to say this really quickly before we move on. Just to be able to meet anyone else that may potentially be in this situation, I had Josh Allen on one of those playoff teams in which I'm going to lose, where I scored the 2nd most points in the playoffs, and I just happened to go up against Amon-Ra and Laporta and Lamar Jackson and a bunch of and CeeDee Lamb, a bunch of guys that happened. It's so bad to lose when you have Josh Allen doing exactly what he did and feel like if I had just played anyone else in the playoffs, I'd have been moving on to the next round. So for anyone else that happened to have that happen to them, I'm sorry. I am here for you. Please know you are not alone.
Yeah.
All right.
Therapy group meets at 3.
Exactly. Let's dive into the Week 15 studs because the guy that I lost to was also awesome. Lamar Jackson, just unbelievable. 290 passing yards and 5 passing touchdowns. That's the 2nd time this season that he has thrown 5 passing touchdowns. By the way, he now has a total of 743 rushing yards this season. It's his 6th consecutive year of having at least 740 rushing yards. Liz, I feel like Lamar Jackson, I recognize how good Josh Allen has been, but it feels like it's almost like a 1A, 1B, or that gap between 1 and 2 is really close with how good Lamar has played recently.
Well, Lamar entered the week as Fantasy's QB1 overall. I'm not quite sure where we're going to tabulate.
I got to figure he's still there because he had 36. So unless the gap was narrower than 5 between he and Josh, probably whatever.
Well,
the
5
bottom line
touchdowns,
is that these guys are
They're both monsters.
Yeah, but for fantasy points, anyways. Well, the point is this:
1A and 1B, yes, yes, 5
He rules.
touchdowns. As you mentioned, he did that one other time this season. It was, I believe, Week 7 against Tampa Bay. Very interesting, though, given the vast number of points between these two teams in the score.
Yeah.
Right at Tampa Bay, that was a bit closer. You know that defense is one of the most thrown on defenses. Also rushed over 60 yards in back-to-back games. Next up, however, Pittsburgh.
Yeah, they gotta have
and
his number.
The
Saturday game, by the way.
regularly struggled against Pittsburgh, and the only time he's gone under 15 fantasy points this season has been against the Steelers.
Lamar has 13 more fantasy points on the season than Josh Allen does.
Oh, good check.
So they are right next to each other. And dude, Lamar's been unbelievable. When I was looking at this, not only does he have all those rushing yards, but he's thrown 34 touchdowns against just 3 interceptions this year. Everything he's been doing is also unbelievable.
Yeah, he had, I don't know if this is good or not, but he had fewer incompletions than he had touchdown passes.
Oh, my
He had
gosh,
4 incompletions and 5 touchdown passes. You tried, Giants. Congratulations. Nice job working closer to that #1 overall pick in the draft.
Dan Graziano wishes that he started Rashad Bateman rather than Zay Flowers, unfortunately, in that matchup against you, because Rashad Bateman went off in this one, too.
And Sue was saying this yesterday. Somebody in the war room, and I don't think it was anybody from this group, said yesterday, I think it might have been Seth Markman, who's oversees the NFL for us and is in the War Room League and has I think he's one of the only. He's the commish. He's a 2-time champ. He's an excellent fantasy player. He was saying those Ravens receivers are just hard to figure out week to week, right? Because the upside for all of them exists, right? Because you have Lamar Jackson and there's a week in which Zay Flowers can get you 25. Rashad Bateman is never going to have 10 catches, or not this year at least for this team, but he's had, I think this is his 7th receiving touchdown of the season after 2 more yesterday. So he can get you 20 fantasy points on a random day. So he is one of those guys that as we look ahead to the next few weeks, maybe not against Pittsburgh, but if for some reason the injury bug hits and you're playing against somebody who looks loaded on paper, you throw a Rashad Bateman type player in your lineup and you just hope for a Marquez Valdez-Scantling like effort.
Yep, 3 for 80 and 2 touchdowns, good enough for 23 fantasy points. That entire Ravens team. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other Ravens players
more on them
later in the show. Let's talk about Tampa Bay, though. Mike Evans and Baker Mayfield. Mike Evans found the perfect week, oh my gosh, to be able to show up for fantasy managers. 36.9 fantasy points, guys.
Is
11 targets,
I don't know.
9 receptions, 159 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He's been in the NFL, how long? What is this, 11th year, 10th year in the NFL?
I think he was a 2014 draft class. I believe this is his 10th straight year.
10th straight year. All right, so this is the 7th most points of his 10-year career. And again, it just happened on the perfect week here in the fantasy playoffs.
By the way, I think he is consistently one of the most underrated wide receivers in fantasy. Every year, we don't know where to slot him when we're talking about drafting Mike Evans. I remember last year, I drafted him really like in Scott Fishbowl, I think it was. I got him way down, in such a later tier. Nobody wanted to take any chances with him because they didn't know what was going to be like with Baker Mayfield, with Mike Evans, and would he have the same productivity? And sure enough, he produced. This year, he missed games with a hamstring injury, and he's still been one of your top fantasy studs, and also proved that he's fully back from this.
That was the point that I wanted to make, that he does not seem limited by the hamstring issue at all. It was still nagging him in practice leading up to this game, so fully healthy.
I think what they're doing is they're capping all the workload to make sure that they have him for the games like this as they try to make a push for some kind of playoff.
Well, let's hope they keep doing that then. Fantasy managers want them.
Exactly.
Please cap that workload.
By the way, like the most impressive part of this, and Baker Mayfield, by the way, who was awesome, 28.02 fantasy points for Baker, is that this was against the Chargers.
Yeah.
Who this season, not like for parts of it, for some of it, for all of this year, have been incredibly stingy. So maybe, and it was one of 5 games going on in the afternoon slate. We had Detroit and Buffalo. We had Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. This probably got less attention than it deserved, but an incredible performance by the Bucs, who, by the way, got contributions from Bucky Irving as well, up over 100 rushing yards for Bucky. A lot of it came on one big play, but good to see him start and make it through that game. So this Bucs offense is a lot of
Baker
fun.
Mayfield, not a fluke, also. I love the point you're making against this Chargers defense that stymied Patrick Mahomes a week ago. Only sacked Baker 1 time, 4 touchdowns thrown, 3rd time this season. So obviously 2023 was not an accident.
No.
You have to feel good about Mike Evans going forward, too, because in addition to what we're looking for in fantasy, he can hit 1,000 yards.
He's 250,
about 251 yards away from it. And if I know anything about Baker Mayfield, he's going to try and make sure that he hits that mark.
And the Bucs are in first place in the NFC South, but because they lost to Atlanta twice, they may need to play out the string here, right? Like, we're getting close enough where you can see a couple of teams in Week 18 making some decisions for the more, the long term, as opposed to trying to win that game. So the Bucs should have plenty of motivation to get to that 1,000-yard mark for Mike Evans.
Feels like the Commanders are in that same spot where they're going to have to continue to keep playing games, and as long as they are throwing the football to Terry McLaurin, things are looking good right now between Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin. 3rd straight game with at least 20 fantasy points. He was an easy top 10 wide receiver in all 3 of those games, Liz. I mean, if you had Scary Terry, you've been cruising right now heading into the fantasy playoff.
I think you just mentioned 5 touchdowns over his last 3 games, right? He tied a season-high 10 number of looks. He converted 7 of those for 73 yards and 2 more touchdowns. He's been on fire. He might face a speed bump, and I know you guys will talk about this later in the week against the Eagles. That is a team that he struggled against, and Jaden Daniels struggled against a little bit earlier. In fact, the last time McLaurin faced the Eagles, he converted just 1 of 2 for 10 yards. So you might need to, if you have McLaurin, not just rest on some laurels, but find a player. Well, you mentioned, you're right, Bateman has the Steelers, but a higher upside player in your flex to maybe chase a couple points.
I don't know if it was his first touchdown or his second touchdown, but like Jaden Daniels scrambling out of the pocket, rolling around for like 7 seconds, and then he just throws a dart into like what seems like 2 wide receivers ending up in the same area, and Terry McLaurin was just like, I mean, he basically mossed his own wide receiver in order to be able to get the football.
Well, and the chemistry we've talked about at the top of the season was a little bit rough. It took a minute to get there, but it remained a point of intention for the offense, and then they did get there, and they've been on fire since. So you love to see, when like the focus pays off, and that there isn't a giving up on the process.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Terry McLaurin, you just keep starting him if you've got him right now in your fantasy playoffs with how well he's been playing. What about James Conner?
Okay.
Is he the sexiest running back in the NFL, my friend?
I just want to say, Mike Evans, most underrated wide. James Conner, most underrated running back for sure coming into this season. It's the pick at the start of the year that everybody's like, I guess I'll take James Conner here. Oh, okay.
He's going to give me solid production, but I don't feel great about it.
We know he's going to miss a few weeks based on injury and his past. Guess what? Guess who hasn't missed time? Guess who now is potentially at the time where you need him the most going to be the guy who can deliver, because Trey Benson leaves with an ankle injury. Mari DeMarcado goes on IR last week because of his back. It is going to be the James Conner show during the playoffs, and that is why you are psyched if you're seeing this performance right now.
And this comes on the heels of a 22.2 fantasy point performance. I mean, he's had 2 of his top 3 games in the last 2 weeks. Again, the week heading into the into the playoffs and the first week of the playoffs, like, it's been fantastic if you've got James Conner. I don't know. I think we have to stop saying he's an unsexy running back. At this point,
Sometimes, consistent and shows up for you. Not as hot.
Everybody likes to be adored
you know what
and
I mean?
prioritized. Just a note. He's cleared 100 rushing yards 5 times this year, this past week 15 being the 5th time. But yes, you're right, Stephania. Everybody likes to be adored and prioritized.
Yeah.
How about, are we at the point now, Field, we adored Malik Neighbors early in the season, and then we kind of got to the point where like, all right, we talked about it. He is who we thought he was going to be.
Right.
Well, if you started him this week, he was more than what you had been expecting.
Well, he got all the targets he's normally been getting, but he was waiting for the pride of Middletown, Connecticut, baby, Tim Boyle, to come in and resurrect this Giants offense. As Tommy DeVito leaves the game with a concussion, so Tim Boyle does come in, and Malik Neighbors, for the first time since September 22nd, scores a touchdown. Like he did 9 celebrations because he's had so many he's been storing up, right? He's out there. He's just like he hit the gritty and then hit like he moonwalked and he did a backflip, just in succession. Like the entire Giants offensive line, like they did a Cool Runnings reenactment. It was great. That didn't actually happen, but that's great.
What a great throwback, Field Yates.
10 catches, 82 yards and a touchdown. I got to be honest with you guys, it's the toughest watch of any offense in the NFL. Doesn't matter. We don't care how. We care how many. And 14 targets from Malik Neighbors. Very, very busy. He, continues to be amongst the target leaders in the NFL, at least on a per-game basis, because he did miss some time. But 10 or more targets in 9 of his 12 games played this season. Malik Neighbors, rock solid. You love those 24.2 fantasy.
He's only gone under double-digit fantasy points 1 time all season, despite, and I think this is your point, Daniel Jones, Tommy DeVito, Drew Lock, Tim Boyle, and he's still managing double-digit fantasy point totals.
Yeah, and I think
because of double-digit
the disgruntled people are the ones that had him in the first 3 weeks and were like, oh my God, I might get 25 points a week, and then he goes, kind of dark for a while there. But thankfully, he had a big volume day yesterday and found the end zone. So 8.2 yards per catch, not enough to slow Malik Neighbors down from scoring 24-plus fantasy points.
Say what you want about the Giants coaching staff, but one thing that they do, we say this all the time in so many different offenses. Why don't they just throw the ball to this guy 12 times a game? The Giants literally care about our fantasy teams because they make sure they force feed Malik Neighbors week in and week out.
Yes, indeed.
All right, another guy that they do that with, CeeDee Lamb. Malik Neighbors and CeeDee Lamb are just like, they are both volume monsters. CeeDee has been a guy that you've been able to start in spite of the fact that Cooper Rush has been under center, but he just delivers again in this game.
And down the field a little bit more, too, than Malik Neighbors.
And, CeeDee's had the shoulder injury, and I do think that has affected him. He had that AC joint sprain. It was tough. We saw him go in and out of a couple of games.
Right? That Thursday night game.
And now he actually looks like he feels better, and he's playing better as a result. And, Cooper Rush is finding him, so that helps.
Yeah, and again, say what you want about the coaching staff, right, for the Cowboys, and we'll see whether they're still the coaching staff of the Cowboys after the season. But to your point, Daniel, 13 more targets for CeeDee Lamb. We told you after Dak Prescott got hurt that, like, the 6-game sample size, again, it was 3 seasons ago with Cooper Rush and Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb, was they're going to throw the football a crap ton to him. They have kept that up, and now they're actually moving the football a bit more effectively. Yes, taking advantage of some good matchups between Cincinnati last Monday night and Carolina yesterday. We don't care. We got nearly 27 fantasy points from CeeDee Lamb. Very nice start to the playoffs.
He also gets to the Bucs next week.
Oh,
so
that'll help.
It feels like you're in a good spot with that.
He's probably going to remain fantasy's wide receiver 1 in terms of targets per game.
Yep. He's been crushing it. All right, let's do a couple of quick Week 15 shout-outs. Liz Loza, we're going to start with you, my friends.
Okay, I want to mention Jerome Ford because last week I wrote about Ford in Facts versus Feelings, and then I highlighted him on FF Now. And then Nick Chubb broke his foot, unfortunately, in this game, and I received a lot of social media messages about how this is somehow my fault, that I have somehow, I do not, for the record, have that sort of power, because if I did, the Bears would not have a 4-9 record, nor would elves need to be placed on any sort of shelves. So I just want to be very clear. However, it is worth reiterating that Nick Chubb went into Week 15 rostered in 85% of leagues, and Ford was only on 31% of leagues. That number has jumped to 32%, so thank you, 1% of ESPN fantasy players, for listening to me.
Be a 1% in life, yes.
He's been the more explosive rusher. He has the preferred pass-catching chops, and he travels to Cincinnati next week, and I think that that's probably a really good matchup. So go ahead and get Jerome Ford. I am sure that Eric Moody will have more on this in the waiver wire article on the Dopp today.
Yeah. A lot of backup running backs are going to be added this week on the waiver wire. My shout out goes to Jared Jeudy, who just keeps dominating. How about this?
awesome.
In a game in which, like, the passing offenses weren't great, I do want to flag a play that we'll discuss later on in the show, I hope. Jared Jeudy on 14 targets, 11 catches, 108 yards. So, how about this? Since the Week 10 bye, Jared Jeudy currently has 120.4 fantasy points. That's wide receiver 2. That's 2.5 fewer points than Puka Nacua. He has 634 receiving yards, the most in the NFL. He has 37 catches, third most amongst wide receivers. He has 50 targets, tied for the third most amongst wide receivers. He's run the most routes with 200, and he has 3 receiving touchdowns, tied amongst wide receivers at 7th. The guy has turned into, like, I don't know, Jerry Jeudy Rice in Cleveland. It's worked out well. Jameis Winston, thank you. Sorry.
A little soon for that.
Calm down on that one. Okay.
49ers fan, obviously a little bit defensive, which I understand. But yes, he's been awesome for the Browns, and Jameis Winston has unlocked yet another pass catcher in this Browns offense.
Yep.
Well, you know, I've been trying to praise running backs throughout the season, and most of them I've been giving the applause to the veteran running backs who've been doing their thing and proving their worth. But how about a younger running back in Chase Brown, who continues to highlight his versatility because he can do it through the air and on the ground, which is really what you want in a running back for fantasy. Yesterday, he gets 1 receiving touchdown and a rushing touchdown, 25 carries for 97 yards, just 3 yards short of his second 100-yard rushing game. He's had 7 touchdowns in the last 7 games. I mean, we usually see the volume, but not necessarily the end zone. He's providing both. He's had double-digit fantasy points in those last 7 games. And remember, 3 of those where he had the single-digit were in the first 3 weeks when he was playing with Zach Moss.
Right.
So when Zach Moss went out with the injury and was placed on IR, all of a sudden it led to this Chase Brown explosion because he's the dominant back in the field. And just look at his finishes here. How many top 10 finishes Chase Brown has had
6 straight
in recent weeks, and it's really helping you out for your fantasy run at the end. If you invested in him, it's paying off late.
Yeah, and if you invested in Jonnu Smith at all, he has been crushing it at the tight end position. Oh my gosh. 11 targets this week, 9 catches for 48 yards and a touchdown, good enough for 19.8 fantasy points. I believe he's tight end 1 on the week,
Kelsey,
as is right now. Weeks 1 through 10.
That one fly.
That one's okay.
I don't care.
That one's okay.
I don't care about that one.
Weeks 1 through 10, he was tight end 16. Weeks 11 through 15, he's tight end 1. He has shown up when fantasy managers have needed him most. 5 touchdowns over the last 5 games. Obviously, Jalen Waddle got hurt, unfortunately, in the second quarter in this one. Jonnu helped pick up the slack for all the fantasy managers. Shout out to Jonnu and all the managers that started him and picked him up off of waivers. This is one of those guys that if you added him off of waivers, he might be like that waiver wire wonder that helps you get to a fantasy championship.
Remember
at the
a few
tight end
weeks
spot.
ago, I was like, I think we overused the term league winner, but I'm convinced that Jonnu Smith might be a league winner.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one.
He just because of the fact that, yes, he was a waiver ad, and yes, you had to be patient, or you might have grabbed him in like week 7, to your point, Daniel. So he has been ridiculous. We'll talk about the rest of the Dolphins in about 30 seconds.
Yes, we will.
At least thank you to Jonnu Smith and Devon Achane, who once again had like 9,000 catches yesterday.
And a great tackle.
And a great tackle that ended up preventing a touchdown, as it was a pick-6 opportunity, and he tackled Kalen Balak with like 3 yards to go.
Don't underestimate the little guy.
Yeah, the Texans ended up winning this game comfortably, so it didn't necessarily matter to the bottom line, but the kind of play that gets you noticed on film, that's for sure.
I want to start now. We're going to dive into our Week 15 duds. Bring it down just a little bit here. But
I
Liz,
want everybody to know we're here together.
well, I want to start with Liz Loza because I guess I just didn't realize this. The top Week 15 dud is Elf on a Shelf. Is that what I'm describing?
No, I don't think anyone's putting Derrick Henry on any sort of shelf. I'm not strong enough to lift him.
Oh, okay. All right.
I
Are
think
you anti-Elf on the Shelf?
Am
though?
I anti? Man, you're really gonna get me in a Grinch mode.
Hold on now. Have you and Mike had this conversation? Yeah, Mike Clay is an
we've had
Elf on the Shelf enthusiast.
That's because he puts Rubik's Cubes in the elves' hands.
That's what it is.
That's exactly what it is.
Mike has calculated every square inch of his home that hasn't been utilized. He's like, well, if you hit 3 inches, 4 feet, and 6, centimeters away from the kitchen, that has been unused before.
He definitely has a spreadsheet with all the different places that they're going to go and all the places they've been.
He told me, which was a nice tip. He put them in the freezer, put some like little scarves and mittens on them, or I guess. I have it.
Okay.
It moves.
Okay.
But I cannot make up these incredible tableaus. Listen, I work full time. It's football season. It's week 15. That elf is getting moved. I hope my kids aren't listening to this, because then I'm gonna we're gonna.
But the elf moves.
Do you have a sectional sofa anywhere in your house? Because if you just move it from one cushion to the next, hey, on Monday it was far left. Tuesday it's middle.
It floats around. It goes in the tree. I actually one year had to give myself a timer, a reminder to move the shelf because I had forgotten. And the little one in particular was like, "Oh no, is it sick?" And I was like, "No, it's not sick. It's just tired. She's just real tired."
Okay, so then it feels like if you had to put a overrated, underrated, or properly rated, then Liz Loza would say Elf on the Shelf is overrated.
Yeah, sure, yes.
All right.
It is another thing to do.
I wanted to get us into a dud mood before we start talking about fantasy performances. I'm sorry to put you on the spot there, Liz Loza. But let's start. You just mentioned this. Miami Dolphins. We'll start with a quarterback, Field Yates, that we have been hyping up so hard. I'm so glad Mike Clay is not here, because Tua was the #1 quarterback over the last month, and he didn't just fail fantasy managers. It was outside of just getting a goose egg, which is so hard to do at the quarterback position, it was basically that 3 fantasy points.
Yeah, 3.84 for Tua in total yesterday. And I think that
it's complicated.
If you're amongst the people that were arguing with Mike, hey, you need to give this guy more respect. One thing that Mike has been spot on with quarterbacks like Tua, and this applies to guys like Jared Goff as well, who have zero value with the rushing, is that when they hit rock bottom on a passing day, you're going to get this. Now, he had nearly 8 fantasy points more than Will Levis. That's neither here nor there, as Will nearly got to 5 points in the negative. But Tua, 4 turnovers yesterday. He just played terribly. Played terribly. Despite the fact that he completed nearly 75% of his passes, did not reach 200 passing yards, threw for just 1 touchdown. That was to Jonnu Smith, as Daniel mentioned earlier in his Jonnu Smith highlight. And just brutal. And it totally impacted everybody that we normally count, or one of the guys we've been counting on of late, which is Tyreek Hill, who has been red hot over the past couple of weeks. He was red cold yesterday. You mentioned the injury to Jalen Waddle as well, Daniel, but just an awful performance from Tua. He had been hot. He was cold yesterday.
Stephania, you gave Tyreek Hill Cole yesterday on FF Now. So
I did. It was deserved.
You have this power.
It was deserved. I mean, yesterday only 2 catches for 36 yards. 5.6 fantasy points. That helps no one in their fantasy playoffs. But I think, it was sort of a reflection of that passing offense as a whole, other than to Jonnu Smith. I do want to say this game was complicated by a very serious injury to Grant DuBose, who was taken off the field on a stretcher, taken by ambulance to the hospital for further evaluation. Very scary head and neck injury. Tua talked afterwards about how difficult it was for him because he threw the ball that ended up being, the
on the play
situation where the player gets hit and taken off. And he said it was difficult to continue after that. And not making excuses, but if you know what Tua has been through with his own injuries, seeing his teammate go off like that based off a pass that he threw and then being shaken, you wonder how much that factored into how it just kept going sideways in the second half. So I would look for a bounce back from Tua next week. I think there's...
They play your Niners.
I know.
Yeah.
And
at home in Miami. Yeah.
I mean, right now, they have a good chance for a good chance for a bounce back if they want to be solid. It was just a week ago that Tua had a 300-yard game. So I think this was a one-off. It was very unfortunate if you were starting him for fantasy purposes, but I do think it gets better.
I just want to add to that. My takeaway also was that the Texans defense, which the pass rush of which had played really well at the top of the season, kind of fallen off a little bit, coming off by, whether it was due to this complication or not, did play at another level, looked as though the bye had done a good amount of help for them. So I think that is a defense that I'm thinking about differently in my matchups.
Yeah, what a weird real-life conversation the Dolphins need to have about who they are as a team. They just feel like, and this is yet another game, so another game against a team that will finish the season with a winning record, but Miami has 1 win against a team with a winning record this season. I believe they're now 1-5 against teams that currently have a winning record, and a lot of those teams are a lock to finish with a winning record because we are so late in the season, and teams like Houston and Buffalo have already gotten to 9 or more wins. Just a fascinating, it feels like with Miami, the problem is this. the ceiling is extremely low for this core, and so much of their money is already tied up in this core. Going forward, it's not a fantasy conversation. I'll tell you guys instead about Derrick Henry because for as great as Lamar Jackson was yesterday, Derrick Henry, not so good. If there is a limitation to Derrick Henry's game, it's of course the fact that he does not often catch passes. Some games he catches exactly 0 passes. Like yesterday when Derrick Henry basically played 50% of the snaps in this game for Baltimore, he had 14 carries. Fine. He had 67 yards, so a little over, was that like almost 5 yards per carry? Yep. Also pretty solid. And yet, 6.7 fantasy points. 0 targets, 0 catches, 0 touchdowns. He's a legend. But, you know, what's hard about a couple of these players, and this will apply more to a guy we'll talk about in just a little bit, is the timing and when it's multiple games in a small subset of weeks, right? You can forgive a one-off, right? Like, there were games in which, you know, Jamar Chase goes under 20 yesterday. It's fine. He was ridiculous last week. But Derrick Henry, you need him to really win weeks for you when it matters most, and he did not.
Derrick Henry has not, he still has, leads all running backs with 15 touchdowns.
Yeah.
But he has not found the end zone in 3 straight weeks.
Yeah.
He has not scored 15 fantasy points since week 10. That guy that you felt like was a lock for, you know, somewhere in that 15 to 20 plus range because of all the volume he was getting and the ability to find the end zone, he just hasn't shown up recently, to your point, Field, as well as you had hoped for.
Lowest total since week 1 at 14, which is not what you want to see when the Ravens are up by over 20 points or by 20 points against the other team. So that, I think, is like the curious part about it. You did mention that he hasn't found the end zone in 3 weeks. The last time was week 11 at Pittsburgh. He gets Pittsburgh this week.
Okay.
Hey, hopefully we can unlock him there.
Saturday football.
So, by the way, it was his first game of the season that was below double-digit fantasy points. So, as bad as the timing was and as unfortunate as the performance was, you're not hesitating to start him, I don't think.
No, you'll still start him next week if you have him. It's just, it was really tough. Hopefully you're able to survive this one. Actually, Derrick Henry was the first of a bunch of running backs that we're going to talk about.
Let's just rip him here because this takeaway is pretty much the same, right?
Yeah. Joe Mixon, only 10.6 fantasy points, 12 carries, but for 23 yards, super inefficient. Yeah. Luckily, he had 5 catches for 33 yards. 2 of Mixon's 3 lowest fantasy point games have come in the last 3 weeks.
He did get hurt in this game. He came back in, but it was another questionable hip drop tackle. A lot of people were talking about it. It was not flagged at the time. We'll see what happens. But remember, his right ankle and the problems that we had earlier in the season after he was injured when he was like at the top, right? And he had that break. Now it's his left ankle. So, you know, he came off. He was limping. I don't totally blame the lack of production on him. I do think the injury factored in.
He had 11 touchdowns over his first 8 games.
Yeah.
But kind of like Derrick Henry, he's just sort of fallen off. Only 1 touchdown over his last 3 games here for Joe Mixon.
Unlike Derrick Henry, though, he's seeing work in the passing game. He tied Nico Collins for a team-high 6 targets. You mentioned his 5 grabs. So at least there's some buoying of the stock there, though I don't like his matchup at Arrowhead next week.
Well, I'll tell you what there also was yesterday, Liz. Some booing. You're booing. I'm booing. 10.6 fantasy points.
Professional.
That wasn't great.
10.6. I just want
Honestly,
to let you know.
If you told me that Joe Mixon was only going to get 23 yards on the ground and the Texans were going to win, I'd be like, oh man, C.J. Stroud must have gone off with Nico Collins. No, that didn't happen either.
Well, Nico had 2 touchdowns.
Nico got saved by 2 touchdowns.
50% of his catch total was in the end zone.
Yeah.
We don't care how it comes. We just care that we get the points.
You know, that's right.
Yeah.
Not how many.
Yep.
You know, the good news for Joe Mixon is he outscored Chuba Hubbard and Saquon Barkley and David Montgomery.
You know what? I guess that is positive. He at least got to double-digit fantasy points. We'll talk about that. All right, let's dive into Chuba Hubbard. Just a heartbreaking performance. It felt like everything lined up for this to be a really good situation for Chuba Hubbard.
A ton of snaps.
Taking on Dallas. And it's in a situation, unfortunately, Stephania, we talked about this last week, no Jonathan Brooks, which means that split backfield.
Bad Bryce yesterday.
It just did not look good, unfortunately. 8.9 fantasy points.
I know. It's sad. I don't think there's much, it was just a bad game for Carolina all the way around.
Terrible. David Montgomery, by the way, had more rushing attempts than he did rushing yards. Just a weird game. Well, what happened was, I think this game, before I blinked and the Bills are already up 14-0. They moved the ball at will.
Kind of got game scripted out of this one.
More of Jahmyr Gibbs.
Too.
He did leave for a little while, left in the second quarter and came back after halftime.
But he ended up, there was a stretch where he had 3 straight completions to him, Montgomery. So, these are bad days at the office. I can't feel too much venom for any of these players specifically, but the one I think that maybe stings the most of the ones that we've discussed is Saquon Barkley. Because Saquon, has been, we were talking about him as not just the fantasy MVP, but the NFL MVP just a few weeks ago. And if I told you he'd get 21 opportunities against Pittsburgh, you'd be like, money in the bank. He got 9.4 fantasy points. Saquon is a very, very good player. He's outstanding. The Steelers' defense also outstanding as they really limited him yesterday to less than 4 yards per carry. He had 2 catches for 9 yards. And I mentioned it, that Saquon, they did have the ball once again at the 1 yard line. And instead it was the Jalen Hurts tush push brotherly shove special. So Saquon misses out on a touchdown opportunity. If he gets those, we're not talking about it in this light today. If he gets just 1 touchdown, we are not saying this about Saquon. But again, you felt like the list of players that you feel like has a real chance to basically win you your league on his own. Saquon is probably the running back that you feel like is most capable of doing that. Wasn't the case yesterday, and we're talking about over the last 2 weeks, the final week of the regular season and the first week of the playoffs. Saquon Barkley under 25 total fantasy, 25 total fantasy points.
Yep.
So not great. Not great, Bob.
It was really tough last week because in spite of the fact that he had a ton of yards from scrimmage, I think 124 yards from scrimmage, didn't find the end zone, wasn't involved in the passing game, and this game again, when you get Jalen Hurts at the goal line as a Saquon Barkley manager, and you're not able to have any, at this point, I'm going to make it a verb, Stephania, because I'm getting bounced in a couple of playoff leagues because Saquon didn't do more here. So it's just, this is one of those tough ones where it's like this guy literally led you to the fantasy playoffs, and this week just doesn't perform, which is not, I don't want to put all of that on him. It's just, we mentioned it earlier in the show. The squeaky wheel of the passing game, it just finally crushed this week, and so they didn't really need to rely on Saquon quite as much.
So I think the last that we can do, whoever wants to take it can take it, because I think we have 2 very important things to close the show out with.
All right, I got a couple. Well, I'm going to add to this one. All right, so let's do this.
Go.
Isaiah Pacheco. Man, if you were hoping and you were waiting for Isaiah Pacheco to come back and be something for your fantasy squad down the stretch, here are his games since returning from injury. Stephania Bell, he had 5.9 fantasy points the first week, 8.1 fantasy points the second week, and then 5.7 fantasy points this week. He has not found the end zone. He has limited passing game work. I've been waiting to get Isaiah Pacheco back, and it just has not. Like, at this point, I'm done trying to make Isaiah Pacheco a thing.
Well, the circumstances surrounding this offense have totally changed since the top of the season when Pacheco was grinding and producing. I mean, Patrick Mahomes is targeting 9 different players a game now. Kareem Hunt is still in the mix. He split the backfield pretty evenly, almost exactly evenly, I believe, with Pacheco. The heartbreak to me of this one was that the game script with the rain and the weather was expected to be a run-heavy game, and Pacheco just did not deliver. There's too many other pieces involved at this point in the season.
And I would have told you, I was definitely more conservative on my expectations for him. This is, for Kansas City, a more important piece of the puzzle to have as they move into the playoffs. They don't care about your fantasy playoffs. I'm not sure if you're aware. But Pacheco coming back, like, this is him getting gradually more and more work. This was a big injury. He had plates. He had hardware put in his leg because of the broken ankle. And we've seen running backs struggle coming back from that. I actually think he's looked pretty good to the eyeball test in terms of how he's moving. But the total number of snaps he's going to get, the involvement in the offense, that's going to be controlled. And I think that's more due to him coming back. And maybe a combination of what Liz is talking about with the way the offense is looking, and there are more options for Patrick Mahomes. So I would not, if you think that Isaiah Pacheco is suddenly going to break out for you in the next week or two, I certainly wouldn't count on it. Might he have a big game? Maybe, but not something I'm looking for.
Not good matchups to do so against Houston and then Pittsburgh. But so 2, I think, really important topics to close the show.
Allow us one more thing. Are you going to move on from Chiefs? I just want to say this.
It involves a Chief, but
Okay, go ahead. Then you go ahead. Go ahead.
Travis Kelce?
Yep, go ahead.
You can do Travis Kelce. That's not what I'm going to talk about.
I just hope that if you had to make a decision between Noah Gray and Travis Kelce, that you chose Noah Gray again. Travis Kelce, 6.7 fantasy points. Unfortunately, he was outscored not only by his own tight end. Dan Skipper, offensive lineman, scored more fantasy points from the tight end position than Travis Kelce. Travis Kelce has as many single-digit games this year as he does games over 10 fantasy points. He had a really nice set right in the middle of the season. But like, as much as we love Travis Kelce and the idea that he's still that guy for Patrick Mahomes, it feels like in fantasy, like he's not a guy that is necessarily going to be like old Travis Kelce.
DeAndre Hopkins is on the team now. Worthy is flourishing. There are just, and there's a load management issue, I think, with Travis Kelce too. Andy Reid has said this. They are saving him for the playoffs. Now, we have to see what happens with Patrick Mahomes' ankle, but
yeah, let's not bury the lead anymore. We probably could have led the show with a few of these injuries because they are significant enough. And Stephania, I'm not going to hold you to what we know because it's Monday at 10:53 a.m. There's so much ahead.
But intel on it.
Patrick Mahomes left the game. Now, the Chiefs said he could have come back in if there were different circumstances.
like a Super Bowl.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, because also we know Patrick Mahomes has played through significant injuries in the past, including a horrible turf toe injury that he had surgery on after they won the Super Bowl.
But this is bad.
Yeah, it was a high ankle sprain. When you saw him get taken down, if you were watching the game, he got bent in all sort of directions. I mean, it was a complete pretzel. I wasn't sure if his ribs were hurt because he did take a big shot to the ribs just before that, but his foot gets trapped underneath him. You could tell by the way they were approaching it. It looked like a high ankle injury. That was confirmed after the game that it is a high ankle sprain. And you know, Patrick Mahomes is going to do what Patrick Mahomes does for the Chiefs, but the Chiefs are going to be smart about it, right? They may decide that if it's really bad, they don't necessarily want to play him. Now, I think that's extreme right now, but these things have a way of evolving over 24 and 48 hours. So what it looked like last night is not necessarily how it looks the next day or the one after that. So you want to pay close attention to what's going on with him.
It's December 16th. They play 2 games by Christmas.
Yeah, they got 3 games in 11 days, basically.
So starting yesterday, that's day 1 of 3 games in 11 days. So yeah, I'm flagging this. Like, and no doubt you feel, I mean, to the extent that you were confident in the Chiefs with Patrick Mahomes, imagine how you're going to feel if it's Carson Wentz, whatever, he's played a lot of football. This is not Tim Boyle as a backup here, right?
A lot of football.
Yeah, I mean, whatever. My point is that, like, you know, you're not going to Tim Boyle behind him, right? Or whatever we saw from the Dolphins earlier this season when Tua was out. But still, it's not exactly like this is not, you know, we've seen some legitimate backup quarterbacks step in and play. You know, Andy Dalton kept that Panthers offense maybe even more than alive. That's a major one. Alvin Kamara left the game for the Saints, and I don't know if you have anything to add. It was a groin injury. Nick Underhill, who's just money in the bank for New Orleans Football. It's a great website down there in the New Orleans area. Called him day-to-day, reported him as day-to-day. We'll see. But, yeah, I mean, Kendre Miller is going to be talked about a lot on tomorrow's show. So injuries, no doubt, a major story. But this is where things get a little bit crazy here. That's why I wanted to bring up Patrick Mahomes, too, is 3 plays that could swing fantasy matchups went down yesterday. And I get it, we have these every single week, but it felt to me like these were a bit different. Patrick Mahomes had 2 passing touchdowns yesterday. Some would argue he had 3. As Patrick Mahomes threw what is being called right now a lateral to Xavier Worthy, who took it 21 yards for a touchdown. I have broken that thing down like it's a damn Zapruder film. I'm not convinced with absolute certainty it's a lateral. I'm also not convinced with absolute certainty it is a pass. NFL does its scoring corrections usually by Wednesday morning. Like, you'll wake up on Wednesday morning with those stat corrections. Tomorrow afternoon, you've got my attention. I am going to try to figure out who it is within the league that does these things, and I want to reach out to see if there's any chance we'll have a conclusion prior to Tuesday afternoon, because that is a potentially 4-point,
4-point swing.
basically 5 points for Patrick Mahomes, because you lose the 21 rushing yards that have now gone to Xavier Worthy. If it were to be called a catch and you play in PPR, it's also another point for Xavier Worthy. That's play 1. So I don't think it's going to be overturned to a pass, but we've seen crazy stuff happen. Play 2. Jonathan Taylor, man. Jonathan Taylor, who actually had a really good game for the Colts yesterday. 107 rushing yards. Here's the problem. He could have had 108 and a touchdown and no fumble.
Yep.
For those that missed it somehow, Jonathan Taylor did the thing where he's running into the end zone and he just stops. He doesn't drop the football, but he's getting ready to kind of just do the thing where he drops it in the end zone. But the ball starts to move as he starts to drop it at like the half-a-yard line, and a play that looked like a clear and obvious touchdown. I think correctly, unfortunately, ruled that he fumbled the ball at the 1-yard line. The ball ended up carrying into the end zone. It's a touchback. The Broncos get the ball. You lose not just 6 for the touchdown, but 2 more for the fumble plus 0.1 for the yard. 8.1 points off the board for Jonathan Taylor.
Does that count as a forced fumble and a fumble recovery for the Broncos defense, do you know, within the fantasy game?
That's a good question. I have to go check that.
Because like, it wasn't forced.
Yes.
It's like when you lose the fumble and it goes out back in. I just thought about that right now.
Good call. I haven't thought about that. I don't know the answer on that. And then finally, the Bengals were amongst the most popular streaming defenses yesterday. And by the way, you're not going to complain about the number of points you got from Cincinnati for the most part, right? Because they had, there was 10 turnovers in this game. I think they picked Will Levis off 4 times. They had a pick 6. But Jordan Battle, the safety from the Bengals, had another touchdown. He's walking into the end zone, and what does he do? And this was like 3 hours before Jonathan Taylor. He also fumbles it. It goes through the end zone.
Untouched by, it's one of those things where you can tell this is why he's a defender, because he went to move the ball into his other hand, and it's this is why you play on defense.
So 6 points that you don't have, which, again, you can't complain when you get 20 plus from your fantasy defense.
You can complain if you lose by 6 points, Field Yates.
6 or fewer, yeah. So yesterday, the Bengals nearly had 3 different defensive players score a touchdown because Sam Hubbard scored an offensive touchdown for them yesterday. Sam Hubbard, who is a defensive end and a team captain for the Bengals, is then defensive captain. Yeah. So just a crazy day yesterday. Jonah Williams and Dan Skipper and Sam Hubbard all scored offensive touchdowns. And then a bunch of guys that we talked about dudded. So I just thought that was a dramatic Sunday. Whether you were on the right side or the wrong side of it, man, that was a dramatic day. And we got 2 more games tonight.
I know.
Let's go.
I need a lot of Bears to come through, Liz. So whatever juju you got for that, if you can get Keenan Allen and Caleb Williams to give me 30-something points.
Keenan Allen prop, so I kind of need that.
I'll take that. I have some crazy threading of the needles that I need to happen tonight.
Now's
so
the time of year where you need it.
I know.
Yeah. I made the wrong decision for what it's worth, and this is just, I'm going to say this, emotionally as a fantasy football manager, I talked about this last week. I had to choose between going with Jalen Waddle or Roma Dunze, and I went with Jalen Waddle in both of my leagues, who ended up getting a 0. And if Roma Dunze scores 20 fantasy points in this one, and I would have won both of those matchups instead of lose both of those matchups, I'm just never going to forgive myself. Is what it's going to come down to, because it's one of
we'll work on it during the offseason.
Oh, it's going to be so hard.
It is easier to lose when you look at your bench and you're like, I did my best.
Yeah, exactly.
I fielded the best team at my avail.
Yeah. We were talking about that. The locker room, we left it all out there on the field.
Nothing you could have done. That's a different kind of loss.
Injuries are a part of the game.
Yep.
You can't beat yourself up too much.
Man, I do really want to see, though, as much as I don't want to see it as an NFC North Detroit Lions fan, I want to see the Chicago Bears be able to come out and end this season strong with Caleb Williams and the pass catchers that they have, because it feels like things have been going pretty well for them.
It wouldn't hurt for your Lions if
I guess if they beat Minnesota, I didn't even think about that, Field.
Sam Darnold hung over 300 passing yards and 2 scores on the Bears at Soldier Field just a couple weeks ago. So.
Well, it sounds like he's
due for
back.
I was going to say regression. It's not
my breath.
Is there a way that maybe Sam Darnold could throw another 5 touchdowns tonight, but they could only go to Johnny Munt and Jalen Naylor? If that happens, I'll probably be okay tonight.
Yeah.
I'll probably come in happy tomorrow.
I'm down by 27 in a league where I have Justin Jefferson, and the other guy has Jordan Addison. So, I need all of them to either go to Justin Jefferson or I'm going to lose that matchup, as long as Jordan Addison doesn't get any. Now, I do have Jordan Addison in the Fantasy Focus League where I'm playing Jackson Agello, and I'm going to crush him for what it's worth. So at least in the free league that I have, just another one. If you play in any free leagues, of course those are the leagues that you advance in rather than the paid leagues that you play.
Oh, no doubt.
Is anyone going tonight?
Yeah, your Bears. I just said.
Oh, yeah, right.
I need Keenan Allen and Caleb Williams to come through, and Jacoby Myers to be quiet as a church mouse.
Yeah, Jacoby Myers.
And
I have Bijan
really
and Drake London in a dynasty league that I'm playing JJ Zacharyson.
Oh, okay.
And this one is going to be tight. But I made this team. I inherited this orphan team and have really managed it. Very proud of myself. Would really love to advance.
Man,
but I need those 2 guys to go off.
So many complicated webs.
I know.
One of them is I'm up 33. My Keenan Allen to his Justin Jefferson, Kirk Cousins, and Roma Dunze.
Oh.
Ooh.
So the projections are neck and neck. They're half PPR. And then I'm also up 37 with my Jacoby Myers and Roma Dunze. So I'm playing with and against Roma Dunze to his Brock Bowers, Darnell Mooney, Drake London, Bijan. So the projections close there as well. It's like these things, and then another one where I think I'm down 13. Sam Darnold, 6-point passing touchdown league. Sam has to outscore, I want to say Keenan Allen. No.
Look at this beautiful mind.
Roma Dunze.
This is a beautiful mind
Keenan Allen.
right here.
Keenan Allen
I'm
and
I got to open my app
somebody
and
else.
see if I even have playing.
Keenan Allen and somebody else. Crap. Who's the other somebody else? Shoot.
The bottom line is
Addison.
fascinating
Field
podcast.
Britannica
6-point
Yates
passing
every
touchdown.
time.
Yeah,
It's the
unimportant
best
stuff,
and
right?
worst time of the year because at least for us, and I don't know how you guys are at home. I would love to know, but like there are times where it's like I just wish I only played in 2 fantasy leagues because then I'm not rooting for and against myself. But this is that time of year where it's like I've got
wish
the
I
same
had
guys.
more.
Yeah.
So I could
like
know I was
But you got so many of your teams to the playoffs because you're such a good coach.
Oh, thank you. So I needed this, Liz.
Is the dilemma that you face. What a wonderful problem to have.
Yeah.
You're right.
You said there are times you wish you played in just 2 fantasy leagues. Listen, there are times in which I wish I was an accountant, right? Like, I have to do any of this crap, this fantasy football stuff. Like I'd rather manage your taxes than manage fantasy
I
football
don't know.
decisions.
I think
felt
I'd
that-
rather manage fantasy football decisions.
I don't think
than
anyone wants
taxes.
me in charge of their taxes.
No.
For the record, no.
I felt that this morning, not only with the Detroit Lions losing, but then losing all of my fantasy leagues because the Detroit Lions played in catch-up games.
Don't
so it's
complain
like,
to me about your team losing in a week when you had fantasy losses too, because somebody over here is suffering greatly.
You know what,
From
Stephania, when you put it
Thursday
that way,
on, like
you're
it
right.
wasn't just one day. I had to suffer from Thursday forward.
A little perspective. You're right. I needed that. I needed
Somebody's
to be put
always
in my
got
place.
it worse than you.
You're right.
Right?
You're right. I'm sorry. I'd like
We
to
just
apologize
want
for
everyone
that.
out there to know that we too
Oh my gosh.
suffer greatly along with you.
100%. All right. That's going to do it for our Monday show. Liz, you are not back tomorrow, but you are going to be here on Wednesday, correct?
I'm here Wednesday for sure. Maybe tomorrow.
Maybe
We'll see.
tomorrow. All right. That's going to do it for us. Today's show is presented by Wingstop. Don't forget to love each other, be kind to yourself, and good luck with your 2 Monday Night Football matchups.
Red needles.
We'll see you guys on Tuesday. Peace.